hopefully the NFL gets some decisions made on how they're handling playoff seeding around this Bills Bengals situation, and we can have a little bit more clarity on, because that makes a big difference on what some of these teams have to play for, and and what players we like, right? Maybe the Bengals have everything to play for. Maybe they have nothing to play for here, and that makes a big difference in how we're building rosters this week, how we're attacking this slate. But yeah, it'll be fun to kind of dive into things, get an early sense of things, and then see what changes from here.
Yeah, I think the play here, and we kind of did some stuff on the fly a little bit differently with Reeves as well. We actually did a Saturday slate breakdown for the first time this year. So if you guys want to check that out with Reeves, that should be up on the channel shortly. Went through some motivation stuff. But in general, I think that we can kind of talk through some of the players when we're building. But I'm a little bit more interested in like the strategy behind this week, because I think like most people, and I talked about this with Jake as well, are just going to be comfortable playing players from teams that we know are super motivated. But from a GPP perspective, like these, like, I guess more muddy situations are probably a little bit more profitable in this week. So like, how do you normally approach this week? Do you kind of like, I guess, skew into the variance and like the randomness a little bit more? Do you still want to like still huddle your core around these teams where we know what's going to happen? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Just overarching.
Yeah, so I always want to embrace uncertainty where there is uncertainty, but I also want to be cognizant of what the risk to reward is. And so on a week, it is very much different year to year. On a week where I see the uncertainty kind of playing out in such a way that there's a high upside, I would expand my bankroll on a week like this. On weeks where it's like, oh, there's a lot of uncertainty, but I don't necessarily see a big edge, then one of the things I talked about on my Inner Circle podcast this week was there's no need to play a player who's low owned, high risk, and his high end outcome is just matching the score that other guys post. And we see a lot of that where people are like, take this sub 1% owned guy, right? Like last week when I sifted through ownership projections and saw Mike Evans at 0.5% owned, I started hammering that drum on the site of like, this guy can blow up more frequently than people realize, right? There was every reason to not like him, but this is a guy that had 30, 35 point upside. I didn't see 50 point upside, but those are the types of plays where it's like, let me embrace as much uncertainty as I can because this guy's low owned. One of my biggest weekends this season was Miles Sanders at 3, 4, 5% owned, where he was 6,500. He can go for 30 plus points. But if you're just getting a guy who's low owned and best game from him is 4x his price tag, that doesn't help you. And people kind of tend to do that. And so if I'm seeing this slate on Saturday as a slate where it's like, okay, that's all I'm seeing, I'm very comfortable lowering my bankroll because I look at everything in DFS as just building up sample sizes. So if the positive sample size I can build up is smaller this week than in other weeks, I just lower the bankroll, right? I'm not influenced by the fact that it's the last week of the regular season and last chance to play a full main slate. I think that's important to think about things that way. One of the spots I want to throw this your way to get your thoughts on this. The Buccaneers are 4-point underdogs to the Falcons.
Yeah.
But the last time they were in a situation like this, right? They can't move above the 4 seed, can't fall below the 4 seed. 2020, they couldn't move above the 5 seed in week 17, which was the last week of the season, and were highly unlikely to fall below the 5 seed. They played their starters the entire game. Obviously, Bruce Arians was the head coach, not Todd Bowles. Todd Bowles has already said that these starters will play. Could be a situation like the Jags last week where once they get their rhythm and momentum going, they take these guys out. But that's a spot that I'm interested in as a sort of embrace the uncertainty spot. And then I'll run through this list here in a moment of like who blew up last year, week 18. But any thoughts on that Buccaneers spot?
I like that, especially because like I still think that like this time, like most people are conditioned now to after a really big, like they got their Evans week maybe in GPP, so that's like, okay, I can't play in the next week. But like this ownership across the board in Tampa Bay is extremely low because people think they have nothing to play for. But like, is there a team out there that like needs to get a little bit of momentum and good juju? Like it is like, I mean, you would think that Brady's just gonna like let's get this thing right before the playoffs, right? So I'm with you. I think that's super interesting.
Like you think of it like Brady's not here just to play in the playoffs, right? If he's playing, if he's lost his wife and family over like continuing his career, he wants a Super Bowl. And part of that is not just, hey, let's get to the playoffs healthy. Part of that is, hey, we finally had a good week last week. Let's build off of that. So that's a spot where I could see, like going overweight the field. And it wouldn't take that much to go overweight the field. You could go 5x the field on these guys and still have that be just a portion of what you're putting in play throughout the week. So I think that's an interesting spot.
The price tags too, Jay. And like these guys are expensive. Like Godwin, 7,200, Mike Evans, 7,400. Like we were reading these guys in the 6Ks for a while. So like even that, like they're not going to pop into optimizers at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And people, after getting burned by this team so many times, and then most people missed out on the big game last week, they're going to just say, "Well, that's it, right? I missed out on
Mhm.
it. They have nothing to play for this week."
Interesting.
Not any other teams that I'm seeing where it's really like, "Oh, everybody thinks they have nothing to play for, and they could be playing guys." But one of the things that I do think we see in this last week of the season is everybody's looking for the young guy who might step into a bigger
Hmm.
role than normal. And what we saw last year, I'm going to run through this list real quickly. Russell Gage had a big game. Dearness Johnson had a big game for the Browns. Nick Chubb was active, had 9 carries. Dearness Johnson had 25. Khalif Raymond had a big game. Alan Lazard had a big game with Aaron Rodgers sitting partway through the game. Devontae Adams sitting partway through the game. Danny Amendola, 7 catches, 113 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Marvin Jones had a big game in that one where the Jags knocked the Colts out of the playoffs. Duke Johnson, who's now retired, now out of the NFL, similar to Danny Amendola, he had a big game, 25 carries, 117 yards. Darnell Mooney, not a veteran
Yeah.
guy, but guy that you kind of don't think of like, oh, here's the young guy kind of stepping up, had a big game. The only sort of random young guy out of nowhere was Amir Smith-Marset for the Vikings. He had only 3 catches. Adam Thielen was out. Dede Westbrook had been featured the week before. So we tend to look at this last week of the season and search for the Amir Smith-Marsets.
Mm.
But what about the Corey Davises or the Chase Claypools
Interesting.
or, these situations, what we saw last year, Danny Amendola, Dearness Johnson, Russell Gage, Marvin Jones, these guys they're veterans, they've put in hard work all season. And the team kind of says, instead of like, hey, let's get a sense of next year, they say, let's feature this
Yeah.
guy or let's give this guy an opportunity to shine. That's kind of the thing that I want to look for because that's what nobody else looks for. And that's what we see a little bit more frequently in this last week of the season.
Yeah, I think that's really sharp because I think that like and this week too, like what I liked about what you said even earlier, JM, is like we should try and like let's if we're gonna be contrarian, let's be contrarian with guys that could just win the entire slate for us. So like wide receivers that still have crazy high ceilings that just are people are like Jamar Chase is a guy on your list that I thought was like
Yeah.
super sharp because like most people aren't gonna go that direction, especially in that Baltimore game. But and he's 8,400, right? And we got Justin Jefferson right there as well with a lot to play for. But yeah, I mean, just from straight raw ceiling, guys like Jamar Chase, guys like Stephon Diggs, like they're going to be like sub 15%. Like those are the type of players that I probably want to take a stand on this week, I think too.
Yeah, I think that the important thing this week is just from a starting point, start it the way you would a
Hmm.
typical tournament week, right? Of like who can win me a tournament, which is already a question that not as many DFS players
Hmm.
ask as they should. Every player you should ask, can this guy win me a tournament? Not can this guy get me 4x? Can this guy get me a solid score? Can this guy actually win me a tournament? And if you start from that starting point, then you kind of get a core list. And it's almost like a smaller slate because there's so many games where there are guys who can't win you a
Hmm.
tournament, or guys who will play half the game and other guys play the other half of the game, and or guys who are playing with backup quarterbacks, a lot of backup quarterbacks this
Hmm.
week, run heavy teams. And so, yeah, if we kind of start from that point, then we can get a deeper sense of, okay, here's who can win us a tournament, and then here's where we might be able to take on some risks. But yeah, I want to bring up Corey Davis
Yeah.
again. He wasn't on the list that I sent you for this podcast, but 3,500, he's at his last 3 healthy games, 6 targets, 7 targets, 10 targets, perimeter guy, downfield role. And nobody plays this guy, right? And so he's 3,500. He should be priced at like 4,800 given his role. And so when we can find guys like that are just totally under the radar, totally off the board, they're just invisible to people. We played, my family played Balderdash over Christmas this last weekend, right? And it was like, if you could, when you're the one reading the word, if you can pick a word that like the definition is one that's just kind of invisible, nobody
Yep.
notices it, nobody votes for it,
Right.
right? And so it's kind of the same thing with like, who's the player that in retrospect you'll be like, oh
Of
yeah,
course.
like I didn't even think about this
Hmm.
guy. There are some players like that on this slate that we can be thinking about and really gain some upside there.
Awesome. Well, let's just circle over to DraftKings here and just kind of piece something together, JM. But before we do that, I just want to make at least an agreement with the people out there watching. If this is your first time here, just welcome, like hang out. It's all good. But if you've been with us all season, the one thing that I want to ask you to do right now is hit that subscribe button because even just looking on the back end of these videos, it's like 60% of the people, JM, watch these videos and aren't even subscribed. Takes 2 seconds, completely free. It really does help out. And then Jam, I also want you to give you the floor to talk about 1 week season, playoffs, all that sort of thing. Let the people know where to find you outside of the show.
Yeah, come to oneweekseason.com, sign up for OWS free. We're making everything free wildcard
Sweet.
week. So sign up for OWS free, get a sense of everything that we have during wildcard week. Everything will be free that week. So That's the best way to get your feet wet and get a sense of what we do over there.
Awesome.
But yeah, we're focused on prepping you for the slate, but more than that, we're focused on training you to be great DFS players, because really DFS is not about picking players. It's about understanding how to win in DFS. And that's really what we focus on at OWS.
Playoff slates, JM, those are like my favorite ones of the year because late swaps get so important. Yes, yet most people just don't care.
Yeah, those games are separated. Yep.
Some of my biggest hits in DFS like have been in the playoff slates, which is kind of funny. But I'm a big late swap person, so those are fun for me. Let's talk about this slate though, JM. If we wanted to kind of attempt at building something in here, do we want to go with the Brady team? I think that's kind of interesting, actually.
Yeah, let's go ahead and go with the Brady team, because we can get a sense of, it's going to be a little bit higher price once we throw in Mike Evans or Chris Godwin. We get a sense of our salary here. And I'm fine with, like, we're taking a big swing on this roster, right? So we're probably, a lot of times on this show, we're talking kind of mid to smaller field, but this is something that I might be focused on, like 5K to 10K entries, right? I probably don't want this on like a 1,000 entry contest, but you could throw on both these guys, throw on one or the other guy. But yeah, I really like the idea of
the double, or we could just like start with one of them, then probably still have room for like a Jamar Chase type of thing too.
Yeah, well, yeah, I kind of like that. Yeah, and it's weird, right? Because we might get word that the way that the seeding works out, maybe the Bengals already have the AFC North locked up. They'll have nothing to play for. But let's go ahead and let's leave that Jamar Chase and T. Higgins as like, these are guys that we really like if that game is being played. But let's build this as a double so that we have something that we know that we're kind of betting on something that is likely to happen.
Yeah. Do you want to have any like Drake London on the other side, Algier? Like that frees up a little bit of salary too.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those teams where when we look at trends and how teams are playing, they are really featuring these two guys. Drake London had only 8 targets last week. That was his lowest target total in his last 4 games. So 8, 9, 11, and 12 is his last 4 games. So Drake London or Tyler Algier, 17 to 20 carries every game. In this scenario, we're betting on the Bucs obviously jumping out to a lead, passing a lot. So I like the idea of a Drake London bring back.
4,900 seems like a great price. I feel like some people don't realize so much different his volume has been like with the quarterback switch too. Just, I mean, the passing volume across the board is totally different. So, okay. I'm in on that. Normally, this is where I bug people to pick some sort of defense just to make it a little bit easier for the people to understand where we're going with this build. So I think the chalk is probably going to be Vikings at 2,900, the Jets at 2,600. I think will be relatively popular, but realistically, defense is always kind of a crapshoot. This week, even more. So is there anything on the cheaper side you want to get tossed in there?
Yeah, so we might not be able to do it on this roster, but I really like the idea of paying up a defense. I like the 49ers. I like the Eagles. I like the Cowboys. They all have something to play for this week. They're all playing backup quarterbacks, and they're all elite defenses. And I think that salary is flexible enough. When we get to the running back position, we'll look at it. But I don't like a lot of the running backs above Kenneth Walker, essentially. And so that kind of allows us to say, hey, if we're saving salary there, maybe we can spend a little bit of extra salary at defense. I would actually like to throw in one of those expensive defenses and then Corey Davis and see what that frees us up for salary, because we might have enough flexibility to really have some fun from this point on in the roster.
Let's go Eagles. Then I'll give you a chance to talk about Miles Sanders, because Miles Sanders is one of the prize picks that I took this week already. I think it's 61.5 rushing yards. So I took the over on that on prize picks. So if you want to take advantage of that, link in the description, code Holka, all that good stuff, get your free $100 bet. But love Miles Sanders this week, and he was on your list.
Yeah, Miles Sanders is one of these guys we've talked about who has this 30-plus point upside. People don't really play him nearly as often as they should. And I'm getting a little bit distracted over here from a cat getting taken out of my office. The ceiling's not nearly as high. I mean, the ceiling's a lot higher than people tend to give him credit for. And because throughout this season, we've had this pattern where he hits when nobody's on him, he misses when people are on him. They end up not playing him because, like, I played him and he busted. He had 4 points, 7 points, whatever. But just so much ceiling. And playing this Giants run defense is so bad in a game that the Eagles need to win, regardless of whether Jalen Hurts is out there or not. I like this Miles Sanders play. I think that if Hurts is playing, Hurts will be popular. So Miles Sanders, some nice leverage off that. Not a big pass catching role, right? So yardage and touchdown back, but we've seen 3 of these games with, I think it's 134 plus rushing yards and 2 plus touchdowns 3 different times this season. So love that. And we still have a lot of salary flexibility here in terms of what we want to do with our tight end, with our second running back spot.
Yeah, I have an idea.
A build like this becomes really attractive.
Just looking at some of your guys, and I know you mentioned that you're kind of on the cheaper side for running back this week anyway. I think we can fit in Mark Andrews and maybe Zach Moss. Let's see if that fits. It does.
Yeah, that should fit.
Talk about Zach Moss for a little bit. I think Mark Andrews makes a ton of sense for a lot of the kind of strategic stuff we talked about before. But Zach Moss at 5,200 seems pretty nice.
Yeah, so Zach Moss, not a big pass catching role. We've actually seen him with Buffalo that he's capable of handling a pass catching role. They're kind of bringing in Deion Jackson for that pass catching role. But if you think about if you are Jeff Saturday, you're starting Sam Ellinger, you're trying to win this coaching job. How do you want to win this game? How do you want to close out this season on a high note? It's probably going to be a ground and pound approach against Houston. And so something like 15 to 18 carries for Zach Moss is pretty probable, right? And so as long as this game stays within range for the Colts, that's what we should expect for Zach Moss. Well, if that's the case, 100 plus yards and a touchdown is very much in play for him here. And he's one of these guys. He reminds me of had a big week earlier this season with James Cook, where James Cook actually bombed, but James Cook, because most people don't pay down at running back, that pay down at running back allowed me to get extra high priced guys at wide receiver. Or in this case, we're able to get Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Mark Andrews, and this Eagles defense, right? That a lot of people just won't have. And so the lower priced running back, even if Zach Moss gets you 8 to 10 points, that's okay because we're using those savings in a specific way. And then if he gets you 20 plus points, it's just a major bonus, right? So Zach Moss is like the one guy in this roster, kind of like you would typically say with the cheaper wide receiver or something, where it's like, okay, this guy doesn't have to win me the tournament. He just has to not lose it for me.